Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are tackling a pretty wild question. Can a boring piece of American financial paperwork actually stop a war thousands of miles away in Central Africa? It's a story that connects your smartphone to global supply chains and the incredible power of just making information public.
I know, it sounds totally backwards, right? Paperwork is usually what starts conflicts, not what ends them. But that was the core idea behind this really controversial law, aimed right at the heart of one of the longest and deadliest conflicts in the world. So let's get into it and see how this was supposed to work.
Okay, so to get this, you first have to understand something called the resource curse. It's this tragic, twisted situation where having tons of natural wealth, instead of making a country rich, actually leads to more violence and poverty. And nowhere has this been more devastating than in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, where this curse has fueled a conflict that's contributed to, get this, an estimated 5.4 million deaths since 1996.
Now, the fuel for this fire comes from four key minerals, often just called the 3 TGs. That's tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold. And these aren't some obscure materials. No, they're absolutely essential for the electronics we use every single day. There's a good chance they're in the very device you're watching this on right now. And for decades, the money from selling them has gone straight into the pockets of armed groups.
So back in 2010, the US Congress decided to try something completely different. Instead of the usual sanctions or interventions, they slipped a special rule into a giant financial reform bill. And this rule, Section 1502, it didn't go after the warlords. It went after the big global companies that were buying their minerals.
Now, this whole thing didn't happen overnight. The law was passed in 2010, the specific rules were set in 2012, and then the rubber really hit the road in 2014. That's when all these publicly traded companies had to start filing their reports. And here's the key. The law didn't ban them from using the minerals, it just forced them to investigate their own supply chains and tell everyone what they found.
On paper, the process was a simple three-step dance. First, companies had to ask themselves, are we using these minerals from this part of the world? Second, they had to share what they found with the public in a report. And third, if they wanted to slap a conflict-free label on their products, they had to get an independent audit to prove it. The whole strategy was to use the pressure of public opinion and investors to make them change.
Which leads us to the absolute core question of this whole thing. Did it actually work? Was this just another annoying compliance task for big companies, leading to a bunch of reports that nobody would ever read? Or did forcing them to disclose this information actually change anything?
Well, the first clue we have suggests that people were paying attention. The research shows that the average report from just one company was downloaded 84 times a year. Now, that might not be going viral on TikTok, but for a super dense, boring corporate filing, that's a lot. It shows that investors, activists, and customers were definitely watching.
And all those eyes seem to have had a huge effect. Look at this. In 2014, when this all started, less than half the smelters companies were using were certified as conflict-free. But just 4 years later, that number skyrocketed to almost 82%. That is a massive, massive shift in how the world sources these materials.
So why all the focus on smelters? Well, it's because they're the bottleneck. They are the single most critical choke point in the whole global supply chain. You can think of them as a giant mineral laundry. Raw ore from maybe hundreds of different mines, some good, some bad, all gets dumped in together and melted down. And the second that happens, poof, the trail goes cold. All the unique fingerprints that could tell you where that ore came from are just gone. That's why certifying the smelter itself, making sure it checks its sources, is really the only effective way to clean up the whole system.
And you know what really talks? Money. The market created this huge financial incentive to get clean. The data shows that as soon as a smelter got that conflict-free certification, on average, 23 new companies would start buying from them. So getting certified wasn't just good PR, it was really, really good for business.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got a US law that creates public pressure, that makes big companies change where they buy their stuff, which then gives smelters a big financial reason to get certified. But does any of that actually matter? Did this whole chain reaction do anything to stop the violence it was supposed to stop?
And the answer when you dig into the data is a pretty shocking yes. Researchers found a 35% relative drop in conflict, not everywhere, but specifically in the mining areas that the law was targeting. This wasn't some random decline. It was a focused reduction right where the law was aimed.
And what's really fascinating is where it worked best. The drop in violence was biggest in countries with weak governments and institutions, the exact places where the resource curse hits the hardest. In countries that were more stable, the law didn't really have an effect. It worked where it was needed most.
But of course, the story isn't quite that simple. There's a twist, because it turns out not all minerals are the same. The 3 T minerals, your tantalum, tin, and tungsten, are easier to trace back to the mine they came from. But gold? Gold is a whole different beast. It's much harder to trace, and it's super easy to smuggle. And that difference turned out to be critical.
And this is where we see a really troubling unintended consequence. The research suggests that while conflict went way down in the 3T mining areas, there's evidence that it actually went up in the gold mining areas. It's like a balloon. You squeeze it in one place and the air just moves to another. It seems some armed groups, finding it harder to make money off 3T minerals, just shifted their whole operation over to gold.
So when you put it all together, what's the big picture here? Well, first, we learned that transparency can be a seriously powerful tool. It creates real pressure on corporations. Second, that pressure is strong enough to actually reroute global supply chains. Third, and this is the big one, those changes can have a real, life-saving impact on the ground. But finally, we also have to see that these solutions are rarely perfect. They can have unexpected side effects, like just moving the problem somewhere else instead of getting rid of it.
The story of this one little rule gives us this powerful, though, imperfect blueprint for how just sharing information can be a tool for change. And that leaves us with one final, huge question to think about. If shining a light on supply chains can do this for conflict minerals, what else could it do? What happens when we apply this same idea to labor rights, or deforestation, or even our global carbon emissions? That's definitely something worth thinking about.